Why I went for Abe. I suppose at this point I ought to tell you something about Abe. I think I told you before he was the English teacher over at the high school. Well, if I didn't, I shoulda. But he was more than that. First off, he weren't real pretty to look at. He had a chest thick as a barrow and moved real quick like in little bursts once he got going. His hands was soft like someone that never worked outside a day in his life, though his arms was puffed up from working out, strong but in a different kind of way than the men around McCaulleysville that worked with their hands all day long. He had a lopsided head that reminded me of a light bulb that kind of swelled and bulged at odd spots, and a little white scar across his forehead that he said he got in an accident when he was a kid. He said he got a lot of money for it, and it was before he could even remember about it, but he didn't like to talk about it. I sort of got the idea that he lost something there. It was Thanksgiving dinner that I finally brought Abe around to see the family. I hadn't really wanted to, but my family had been after me for some time, and Abe, he'd made some comments like I was either shamed of him or shamed of my family, and maybe the truth was, maybe a little of both. But whichever it was time to get it over and just bring everything out in the open. As long as we're honest and open about everything, he said, nothing bad will happen. Poor baby. How can anybody go to college so many years and still be so stupid? I just don't know. But anyways, I told my folks I was bringing a friend over for Thanksgiving dinner and not to be surprised because he was a little older than I was, but he was a nice man and I liked him an awful lot. So I thought things was all set up for Abe and me to arrive, but first off when we got there, Papa, he couldn't stop staring. He was standing there on the porch with his mouth open like he was fixing to catch flies. I had to tell him 3 times to shake hands with Abe, but I tried not to make a big deal out of it. Just kind of wheeled it into the conversation like, this here's Abe, I know him from school. Let me introduce Abe to you, Daddy. He's a friend of mine from school. I don't think I properly introduced Abe to you, Daddy. I guess we should shake hands and go inside. I can't account for what made him all so antsy about Abe, except that he was near as old as my folks, and he was black, like I said, so I reckon those 2 things. My grandma's was sitting on the couch eating caramel popcorn. That's regular popcorn, with caramel poured all over it till it gets all gooey and sweet-like. And Grandma Betty Lou, I know she didn't need any more on account of her diabetes, but she always said holidays and the 4th of July were days she got to go off her diet. Like the diabetes would go on holiday those days. So she was digging in up to her wrists and shoving great gobs of popcorn into her face. Not a pretty sight, I've got to admit, bless her heart. And now and then offering Abe a handful, which he politely declined, saying he was waiting for Mama's wonderful turkey dinner that he could just smell coming from the kitchen. Uncle Willie was the family historian. Our people go way back, you see. The stories they tell, the first Macaulay came over after a war against the English, and the English drove all the Scots out of Scotland, which I guess ain't totally true, seeing as there's still some over there, but out of our part anyway. For a while in parts of Carolina, there was parts that still spoke the old language, but that's mostly dried out by now. But they still people like my Uncle Willie that still keep to the old ways. And every holiday he'd pull out his bagpipes and let 'em rip. I always thought the sound of them things sounded like love-struck cats serenading a herd of cows, and the cows moving back. But I guess I kind of got used to it after a while, 'cause no Thanksgiving would be complete without Uncle Willie and his bagpipes. And then he'd pull out his whiskey. It weren't Scotch, but what our people made here in this country from the recipes brought over on the ships that brought 'em here. Uncle Willie, he was a regular scholar of old-timey stuff. Then after the bagpipes and the whiskey lecture, Willie'd set to serious drinking. That's part of the tradition too, I reckon. This time was a little different as he got Abe to drinking, which I knowed wasn't a good idea. But how was I going to say something to full-grown men, and me just being a girl and Abe being a teacher with a doctorate degree and all? So Abe was going on about all the poverty in the world and said something about in some countries they ain't got but 1 pair of underwear for every 2 people. Well, I knowed what he was talking about, that we don't realize how good we got it, how rich we really are here. And now, on this day of Thanksgiving especially, we ought to be mindful of our blessings and might should turn our thoughts, even only for a minute or so, to those that ain't as fortunate as us. But I could have told him not to use that particular bit of logic with my Uncle Willie and Daddy. They jumped all over it. Willie, my daddy says, confidential-like, you suppose I might could use your underwear tomorrow? I got to give a sermon in church, and I want to make a good impression. Well, I don't know. I was planning on going out Saturday night, and they might not be in the cleanest condition in the morning. Don't know what your flock would think. Mama, she wasn't doing much cooking right then because she'd been into her vodka since around noon. See, it was Mama's habit to have what she called a cocktail round about 3 o'clock. Then she had a aperitif made the same stuff, and then a before-dinner cocktail. So by around the time we was ready to eat, she was pretty wobbly. This was her usual schedule, but on holidays, she sped up the clock a bit. She'd start drinking around noon when the turkey got put in the oven and wouldn't stop till the turkey or her was put to bed. So she was already pretty far gone by the time Abe arrived, and she took to eyeing him like a mama sheep staring down a stray dog. My daddy was more direct. He come round the table like that same stray dog. I can use the same metaphor. A metaphor is what my English teacher calls it when one thing stands in for another. You see, that's the metaphor part. His legs still and a peculiar sharp look in his eye, and he starts chatting with Abe real polite like, "How'd you happen to meet my daughter?" And as soon as Abe would explain, hardly waiting for him to get the words out, Daddy would point out something like, "There's quite an age difference between you, ain't there?" My grandpa, he's sitting at the table and says something to me. "Angel Louise, honey, pass me some of them nigger toes, would you?" "Grandpa, they're not nigger toes, please." I was trying to shush Grandpa and listen out of the corner of my ears at the same time. "You got to be careful about such things," my daddy was saying. "When a fellow such as yourself—" Daddy wouldn't come right out and say Abe was near old enough to be my daddy himself. "Takes an interest in a girl young as my Angel Louise." You'll note that Daddy didn't say nothing about my being a young white girl, even though his meaning was as clear as if he'd got up on top of the porch roof and shouted it to the neighbors. Most people can't help but think he ain't got but one thing on his mind. "What do you think, mister?" I heard Abe ask, as politest as he could. "I'm not talking about me, mind you. I got an open mind about such things," my daddy said without naming what some such things might be. But it might as well have been with a wink and a nudge in the ribs, like Abe and me were doing all sorts of things which we hadn't been up to at that time, and might not have if my folks hadn't put such ideas in our head. But I couldn't listen no more because Grandpa thought I had been telling him he couldn't have any of those chocolate-covered cherries, and took to reminding me that since it was a holiday, the rules didn't apply, like we were Jewish or something and had these special dietary laws that governed us all the rest of the year except for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the 4th of July, and that he could have as many as he wanted. After all, it was his seed that had made this whole goddamn family, so he was due some respect. The mention of his seed made Grandma Lucy May blush and made my mama hiss, "Papa!" But he kept on. "So I'll eat as many of them goddamn nigger toes I want." At which point I was so near fed up with him that I just shoved the whole goddamn bowl at him. If you'll excuse my Dutch, but I was only quoting. "Have your goddamn nigger toes. I hope they comatize you." And turned back to Daddy and Abe to hear Daddy nattering something to Abe about how a grown man finds a nubile girl very enticing, but after all, there's laws about such things, not specifying what those laws might be. It was about this time that I noticed Abe's jaw getting all tense and the neck muscles in his neck starting to tense up, but he asks, with only the slightest edge in his voice, "You like jokes, Mr. Macaulay?" "I suppose I like 'em as well as the next fellow," my daddy told him with a sly grin that I ain't never seed before, "as long as they ain't too dirty, or if they are, they ain't told in mixed company." "Well, I think you'll like this one. It'll really tickle you." And Abe leaned real close to Daddy and lowering his voice so he could just barely hear him said, "What does a redneck girl say when she loses her virginity?" Papa changed colors then. It was his turn to get mad, and you could tell he was fixing to. And even though Abe had spoke real soft-like, he'd said the last word loud enough so everybody else could hear. "Get up, Pa, you're crushing my smokes." The whole room went quiet. You'd have swore everybody had been struck by lightning and froze up in time just like that. My daddy looked like Mr. Brimmer's cow after Mr. Brimmer took a sledgehammer and whomped it between the eyes, not real steady on his feet, but not quite ready to fall down neither, till he gave himself a shake and screamed something like, "You child-molesting, perverted nigger son of a bitch!" And when he ran out of bad things he could scream, he goes for Abe. Abe stands up and catches Daddy coming at him, and the two are fighting in the middle of the room, struggling over the turkey dressing. Mama's standing at the door of the kitchen with a bottle of vodka and a glass of grapefruit juice in her hands, whining, "What's going on? What's going on?" Grandpa's insisting that he didn't hear. What'd he say? Longevity? What's a redneck girl say when she loses her longevity? Grandma's Lucy May and Betty are sitting on the couch stuffing caramel popcorn in their mouths like they was watching a movie at the Main Street Cinema. And it seems like I'm the only one that has any sense. I'm jumping up and down between these two fools, screaming at them to stop. Abe, leave it alone. We're going. Abe, we're leaving. And I drag Abe out the door, though I have to admit he must have let me because there was no way I could have dragged him if he didn't. When we were outside, I could just feel how angry poor Abe was. Every muscle was tense and his voice was shaking. You hear what he said to me? You hear what he was saying about you? I was scared that he was going to go back inside and do something, or that if we stuck around, my daddy was going to do something, and I didn't want to be visiting neither of them up at the state pen, so I shouted, Abe, get in the car. And much to my surprise, that's what he did. That's when my daddy come down the steps and picked up a handful of gravel from the driveway and begins throwing them at us so hard it broke Abe's windshield. But at least we hadn't been shot at. But I was mighty feared that was going to come next. My daddy was throwing rocks at his car and breaking his windows. Grandma Lucy May and Grandma Betty Lou were sitting on the sofa and staring out my folks' big old picture window at the show, eating their caramel corn. Grandpa was stuffing his face with nigger toes. All right, I said it, I'm bad. I'll just go to the place where bad people go. And Mama was screaming at the door that somebody spilled her liquor. And Uncle Willie, with this gleeful look on his face, was blowing away at the bagpipes like he's piping the boys up the hill for one last shot at those English sons of bitches. And all the time I'm screaming at poor Abe, get out of here. For the love of Jesus H. Christ, get out of here. Though I knowed full well that Jesus didn't have nothing to do with it, I was just afraid Abe was going to get himself killed. We drove about 5 miles in 3 minutes when I told Abe to stop. Just pull over. I told him, on account as I was afraid we'd get in a wreck from the way he was driving. Abe, that was crazy. I wanted him to think about what happened. I wanted us to talk about it, get it out. I know, I'm sorry, he said. I'm not usually like that. I know he said some ugly things to you, I told him. Is our age difference a concern to you? Age is just a number, I said. That I'm black? Black's just a color, just like white. Anyway, none of what he said about me bothered me. It was what he said about you that I got angry at. I swear my heart leapt like a frog on a hot plate up when I heard him say that. I ain't never before had anybody take my side in anything. You're going to think I'm a totally bad girl, but I wanted him then. Wanted him worse than I'd ever wanted anything before in my whole life. Wanted him in ways I didn't even know, but wanted him totally.